In 1900, a Greek sponge diver working off the coast of a small Aegean island pulled up a fragment of corroded bronze from a Roman-era shipwreck sitting 45 meters below the surface. The fragment was unremarkable at first glance, encrusted, damaged, easily mistaken for a decorative fitting or a broken fixture. But when researchers finally looked inside it decades later, they found something that should not have existed: a functioning system of interlocking bronze gears, differential mechanisms, and inscribed astronomical scales capable of predicting eclipses, tracking planetary cycles, and calculating the positions of celestial bodies years in advance. The object is now called the Antikythera Mechanism. It dates to roughly 100 BCE. The technology it contains, mechanically, conceptually, was not thought to have appeared anywhere on Earth for another 14 centuries. That gap is what this investigation is about. Not the drama of the inexplicable, but the specific, documented, measurable distance between what an object is and what the world it was found in should have been capable of producing. That distance appears, quietly and persistently, at sites and in artifacts spread across the ancient world. It shows up in machines, in maps, in surgical tools, in astronomical records, in architectural decisions that imply knowledge of principles we didn't formally codify until much later. The question threading through all of it is this: what happens to our understanding of ancient capability when the evidence consistently outpaces the timeline we've built around it? 7 discoveries. 7 places where that question becomes impossible to dismiss. We begin where the question is most concentrated, with an object that, even after more than a century of analysis, continues to surprise the researchers who study it. The Antikythera Mechanism was recovered in 1901 from a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera, part of a cargo of statues and luxury goods being transported, most likely from Rhodes or the eastern Mediterranean, sometime around 60 BCE. The wreck was identified by sponge divers working the area. The mechanism fragments were brought to the surface alongside bronze statues and marble reliefs, and then largely ignored for decades as the more visually impressive finds absorbed attention. It wasn't until 1951 that the British historian Derek de Solla Price began serious analysis, and not until recent decades, with X-ray tomography and advanced imaging, that the full complexity of what the fragments contained became clear. What emerged from that imaging was extraordinary. The mechanism incorporated at least 30 distinct bronze gears, meshing in configurations that implemented a differential gear system, a design element not independently documented in any other historical source until Renaissance-era clockwork, roughly 1400 years later. The front face carried a dial tracking the solar and lunar calendars simultaneously, using a 5mm pin and slot mechanism to model the irregular speed of the moon across its elliptical orbit. The rear face carried 2 spiral dials, one tracking the 18-year Saros cycle, used to predict eclipses, the other calculating a 19-year Metonic cycle for reconciling solar and lunar calendars. Inscriptions on the casing described the mechanism's functions in language that implies it was designed for use by non-specialists, possibly as an educational or demonstration device. The mainstream explanation is that the mechanism represents the output of a sophisticated Hellenistic tradition of mechanical astronomy, likely associated with the mathematical and astronomical school at Rhodes. Cicero mentions devices capable of modeling planetary motions, and there are textual references to mechanical celestial globes in the ancient world. The Antikythera Mechanism, on this reading, is not an isolated anomaly, but the one surviving physical representative of a tradition that produced similar devices and then vanished when the specific workshops and knowledge networks that sustained it were disrupted by war, by institutional collapse, by the general fragility of craft knowledge when it isn't written down. That explanation is plausible and intellectually serious. The complication it faces is one of physical evidence. If this tradition was real and produced multiple devices, where are the others? Not even a fragment of a comparable mechanism has surfaced in any other excavation or collection. The Antikythera Mechanism stands completely alone in the material record, a sophisticated product of a tradition that has left no other physical trace whatsoever. For a manufacturing tradition, complex enough to produce differential gearing, that absence is difficult to account for. The imaging studies conducted since 2005 continue to reveal details that were not previously known. As recently as 2021, new analysis of the front plate inscriptions identified text describing the planets and their cycles that had not previously been decoded. The device is still not fully understood. After a century of study, it is still giving up information. What else did the ancient world know how to build that simply didn't survive? In the late 1930s, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König, working at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, examined a small clay jar, roughly 14 centimeters tall, that had been found at a Parthian site near the village of Kuyut Rabua, southeast of Baghdad. Inside the jar was a copper cylinder, and inside that cylinder, suspended without touching the walls, was an iron rod. The assembly was sealed with asphalt. König looked at it, recognized the configuration, and published a paper in 1940 suggesting that what he was looking at was a galvanic cell, in other words, a battery. The jars date to the Parthian period, approximately 250 BCE to 224 CE. If König's interpretation is correct, they represent the generation of electrical current roughly 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta's invention of the electrochemical battery in 1800. Experiments conducted since the 1940s have confirmed that the basic configuration works. Fill the jar with an acidic electrolyte, grape juice, vinegar, or citric acid solution, all of which were readily available in the ancient Near East, and the copper-iron arrangement generates a small but measurable voltage, typically in the range of 1 to 2 volts. The physics are unambiguous. The assembly, as found, is functionally capable of producing electricity. The debate is not about whether the jars can generate current. It is about whether they were designed to do so, and if so, for what purpose. Several researchers have proposed that the jars were used for electroplating, applying thin coatings of gold or silver to objects through electrolytic deposition. Gilded objects from the Parthian and Sassanid periods have been examined for evidence of electroplating, and while some researchers believe they've identified signatures consistent with the process, the analytical results are contested. The alternative explanation, that the jars were simply storage vessels for scrolls or organic materials that happened to include a copper cylinder as a preservative or structural element, has also been advanced. What makes the Baghdad battery unusual is the precision of its configuration. A storage vessel does not need a copper cylinder precisely fitted inside it with an iron rod suspended centrally. That arrangement is specific. It is not a byproduct of another function. It is either an intentional electrochemical assembly, or it is a storage container built to tolerances that have no practical justification. Neither explanation is fully comfortable. The wider question, whether the Parthian world had any theoretical framework for understanding what this assembly was doing, has no clear answer. Electrical phenomena were observed in antiquity. Static electricity from amber was documented by the Greeks as early as the 6th century BCE. But there is no textual evidence from the Parthian period suggesting any systematic understanding of galvanic current. If the jars were batteries, the knowledge of how to make them may have been entirely empirical, a craft tradition without a theoretical foundation, discovered through experiment and transmitted through practice rather than writing. A technology that works, built by people who may not have known exactly why it worked. That is not impossible. It is, in fact, how most technology develops. It is also how most technology disappears. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Upper Egypt is one of the best preserved temple complexes from the late Ptolemaic period. Its construction largely complete by the 1st century BCE. Its walls are covered in carved and painted reliefs of extraordinary detail, ritual scenes, astronomical charts, depictions of deities and offerings executed with the formal precision of an artistic tradition several thousand years old. Most of these carvings are well understood in their religious and iconographic context. A few are not. In the crypts beneath the main sanctuary, low, narrow chambers accessible only through small openings in the temple floor, a series of carved reliefs depict objects that have generated sustained interpretive disagreement since they were first closely examined. The reliefs show large elongated bulb-like shapes, wider in the middle and tapered at both ends, with what appears to be a serpent figure emerging from the base within each bulb. Beneath the bulbs, in some panels, stands a Djed pillar, a symbol associated with stability and the backbone of Osiris. Connecting the bulb to the Djed pillar is what appears to be a braided cable or cord. The mainstream Egyptological interpretation is that these are symbolic religious images. The bulb shapes are lotus buds or stylized representations of serpents in their primordial state. The Djed pillar is a standard religious symbol. The overall composition is a ritual scene whose meaning is encoded in the symbolic language of late Ptolemaic religion, rather than representing any physical object. This interpretation is consistent with the broader context. Temple crypts were spaces for ritual and symbolic storage, not for housing equipment. The alternative interpretation, advanced by a minority of researchers and widely discussed in archaeotechnology circles, is that the reliefs depict a functional light source, specifically something resembling a Crookes tube or discharge lamp, in which a filament or gas within an evacuated vessel produces light when energized. This interpretation notes that the braided cable resembles an electrical conductor, that the Djed pillar has been proposed by some as an insulating stand, and that the overall configuration matches the layout of a high-voltage discharge apparatus closely enough to be worth asking about. The honest position is that neither interpretation closes the case entirely. The religious reading is more consistent with the overall context of the site, but the visual correspondence between these carvings and the components of an electrical discharge device is specific enough that dismissing it without rigorous analysis is also not fully satisfying. No experiment has been conducted that attempts to build a physical object matching the carvings and test whether it produces light, which would either confirm or refute the functional interpretation fairly definitively. That experiment remains unmade. What we have, for now, is a carving in a sacred space that looks, to certain technically trained eyes, like a piece of equipment. Whether it is, and whether that observation means anything, is a question the crypt walls have not yet answered. Around the 6th century BCE, in the northern Indian city of Varanasi, a physician named Sushruta compiled a medical text that would eventually be recognized as one of the foundational documents of surgical history. The Sushruta Samhita describes over 300 surgical procedures, more than 120 surgical instruments, and detailed protocols for operations including cataract removal, rhinoplasty, hernia repair, the extraction of foreign objects from wounds, and caesarean section. It classifies wounds by type, describes techniques for suturing with materials ranging from thread to the mandibles of large ants, and includes instructions for preoperative preparation and postoperative wound care that demonstrate an understanding of infection risk that was not formally systematized in Western medicine until the 19th century. The instruments described in the Sushruta Samhita, categorized into blunt instruments, sharp instruments, and thermal instruments, include forceps, specula, trocars, catheters, syringes, and a scalpel design with a blade thin enough to shave hair. Many of these forms are recognizable to a modern surgeon. Several are identical in their described function to instruments still in use today. The mainstream historical interpretation is that the Sushruta Samhita represents the sophisticated output of an Indian medical tradition with roots reaching back well before the 6th century BCE, a tradition that accumulated practical surgical knowledge over generations through direct clinical experience, without necessarily requiring any formal theoretical framework of anatomy or physiology in the modern sense. Surgery on this reading was a craft discipline, and the Samhita is its craft manual. This interpretation is credible and well supported by the broader context of Indian intellectual history. What generates ongoing discussion is the gap between the procedural sophistication documented in the Samhita and the contemporary understanding of internal anatomy that it implies. Rhinoplasty, the reconstruction of the nose using a flap of skin from the forehead, requires not just anatomical knowledge of the facial structures, but an understanding of vascularization, the blood supply that keeps the flap alive during the transfer. The Samhita describes the procedure in enough detail that it has been successfully performed by modern surgeons following its instructions. A procedure that requires vascular awareness, executed successfully by a physician working without any formal circulatory theory, implies a level of empirical understanding that the text's theoretical framework doesn't fully account for. How much did ancient surgeons understand that they could not yet describe in the language that would have made that understanding legible to later historians? 4 discoveries, 4 different parts of the ancient world, a mechanical computer from the Aegean, possible electrochemical cells from Mesopotamia, disputed electrical imagery from Egypt, surgical sophistication from India that outpaces its theoretical context by centuries. The question that opened this isn't getting simpler. What happens to our understanding of ancient capability when the evidence consistently outpaces the timeline we've built around it? Each of these cases has a credible conventional explanation. And each of those explanations, looked at carefully, has a residual edge where something doesn't quite fit. The mechanism that survived alone. The instruments that work without theory. The carvings that look to a trained eye like something functional. The 3 discoveries that follow push on that edge from a different direction entirely. Not objects, but constructions. Not things that fit in a museum case, but structures that alter the landscape they sit in. There are over 100 of them sitting in museum collections across Europe, and not one ancient written source, not a single Roman text, inscription, military record, or household inventory mentions what they were for. Roman dodecahedra are hollow bronze objects, roughly the size of a fist, shaped as 12-sided polyhedra, with a circular hole of varying diameter cut into each pentagonal face and small knobs or balls projecting from each of the 20 corners. They range in size from about 4 centimeters to 11 centimeters across. They have been found across a broad swath of the former Roman Empire, predominantly in Gaul, the Rhine frontier regions, and Britain, dating from roughly the 2nd to 4th centuries CE. They are well made. The bronze casting is precise. The holes on opposite faces are consistently sized relative to each other. And that is more or less the extent of what we know with any certainty. The absence of any textual reference is itself the primary mystery. Roman material culture is extraordinarily well documented. The Romans wrote about tools, about games, about religious instruments, about military equipment, about household objects of every description. The dodecahedra appear in none of it. They are not mentioned, catalogued, depicted in mosaics, listed in inventories, or referenced in any known correspondence. Objects of this quality, clearly manufactured with care, found across a wide geographic distribution, were not improvised or marginal. They were made deliberately and in quantity. Someone knew what they were and what they were for. That knowledge simply did not enter the written record, or if it did, the record hasn't survived. More than 100 proposed functions have been advanced by researchers over the past 2 centuries. Candle holders. The varying hole sizes could accommodate different candle widths, and some have been found with traces of wax. Surveying instruments. The geometry of the holes allows the dodecahedron to function as a rangefinder for calculating distances, and the Roman military had clear use for such tools. Knitting guides. Experiments have shown that the knobs and holes can be used to produce specific patterns of finger warmers or gloves, and several have been found in contexts associated with textile production. Astronomical instruments. The hole sizes correspond, in certain analyses, to the angular diameters of the sun at specific dates in the Roman calendar. None of these proposals has achieved consensus. The candle holder hypothesis is compromised by the fact that the holes are of different sizes on the same object, which is unnecessary if the function is simply to hold a candle. The surveying hypothesis works geometrically, but has not been confirmed by finding dodecahedra in documented military or engineering contexts. The knitting hypothesis is supported by experimental evidence, but struggles to explain why such a specialized textile tool would be made in bronze, at considerable expense, when simpler materials would serve equally well. What no hypothesis has yet explained satisfactorily is the combination of features: the consistent 12-sided geometry, the varying hole sizes arranged in a specific pattern on each object, the corner knobs, and the complete geographic restriction to the northwestern provinces of the empire. Dodecahedra have not been found in Italy, in North Africa, in the eastern provinces, or anywhere outside the northwestern frontier zone. Whatever they were for, it was something specific to that region, practiced by a population whose relationship with this object was apparently never committed to writing in any form that survived. An object that was common enough to be manufactured in quantity, specific enough to be confined to a single region, precise enough to be made in bronze, and invisible to the entire written record of the civilization that produced it. The Roman world was many things, but silent about its own material culture was not typically one of them. About 50 kilometers east of the city of Abancay, in the Apurímac region of Peru, resting on a hillside at roughly 3,500 meters elevation, there is a single boulder of grey andesite, roughly 4 meters long and 2.5 meters wide, whose upper surface has been carved into a three-dimensional topographic map of extraordinary complexity. It is called the Sayhuite monolith, and what has been done to it is, by any technical standard, remarkable. The upper surface of the boulder is covered in over 200 carved figures and features arranged across a contoured relief that rises and falls in ways that precisely mirror the terrain of the surrounding Andean landscape. Channels, some as narrow as a finger's width, run between carved pools, reservoirs, terraced platforms, and what appear to be representations of irrigation systems. Animal figures are integrated into the topography: jaguars, serpents, frogs, lizards, rendered in the round but scaled to the landscape they inhabit on the stone surface. Stairways descend from upper levels to lower ones. The whole composition is unified by a hydraulic logic. The channels connect the elevated pools to the lower ones in a system that, when water was introduced at the highest point, would have flowed through the entire carved network in a controlled and deliberate sequence. The monolith is attributed to the Inca or to a pre-Inca Andean culture, and it dates to sometime before the Spanish conquest of the 16th century. Beyond that, the scholarly record becomes considerably less certain. The Sayhuite monolith has been discussed in Andean archaeology since the 19th century, but it has received substantially less systematic study than its complexity arguably warrants. Its function is debated. The most widely accepted interpretation is that it served as a ritual or ceremonial object, a sacred landscape in miniature used for divination, for water offerings to the Andean deity system, or as a model for hydraulic planning. The integration of water flow into the carved design supports the ritual water interpretation, as water held deep spiritual significance in Andean religious practice. What the functional interpretation leaves incompletely addressed is the technical dimension of the carving. Producing a topographically accurate three-dimensional relief of a specific real landscape, at scale, in andesite, with a hydraulic channel network that actually functions, requires first having a detailed spatial understanding of the landscape being modeled. It requires the ability to translate that three-dimensional understanding into a carving plan executed on a boulder, whose natural surface contours are themselves irregular. And it requires the stoneworking capability to execute channels narrow enough that surface tension controls the flow of water through them. The question of whether the Sayhuite monolith is a model of a specific real landscape, and if so, which one, has not been definitively answered. Some researchers have proposed correspondences between the carved topography and the actual terrain of the Apurímac region. Others have suggested it is a generalized sacred landscape rather than a map of any particular place. The distinction matters because a monolith that accurately represents a specific real geography is a fundamentally different kind of object, cognitively, technically, and historically, from one that represents a generalized, idealized terrain. The surface of the monolith has been damaged over the centuries. Spanish colonial era accounts suggest that deliberate defacement occurred following the conquest, as part of the broader campaign against Andean religious sites. What is visible today is a partially compromised version of what was originally carved. What the complete undamaged surface showed, the full extent of the hydraulic network, the full inventory of figures, the full reach of the topographic representation, is something that can now only be inferred. A carved landscape, built to hold water, detailed enough to be a map, and damaged before anyone thought to make a complete record of it. The question of what it was modeling, and for whom, is one the stone can no longer fully answer. This last discovery is not a single site or a single object. It is a pattern that emerges when you look closely at the metalwork of ancient Egypt, specifically at the precision fitting and alloying techniques documented in objects from the Old Kingdom period, roughly 2600 to 2100 BCE, and what those techniques imply about the metallurgical knowledge available at the time. The iron headrest found inside Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 is among the most discussed examples. The object is made of meteoric iron, identifiable by its nickel content, which distinguishes it from smelted iron, and it was worked at a time, approximately 1325 BCE, when iron smelting was not yet in common use in Egypt. That in itself is documented and broadly accepted. What has received less attention is the quality of the working. Meteoric iron is an extremely hard material. Shaping it into a formed object with visible surface finish, without the controlled high-temperature environment of a furnace capable of making the metal workable, requires either cold working techniques of considerable sophistication or a heat source and tool set that has not been identified in the archaeological record for this period. More broadly, the copper alloys of Old Kingdom Egypt, analyzed in recent decades using spectrographic methods not available to earlier researchers, show a consistency in their tin and arsenic content that implies deliberate, controlled alloying. Producing consistent bronze requires either the ability to analyze and select ore sources with specific mineral compositions, or the ability to add alloying elements in controlled quantities during smelting. Either approach requires a level of metallurgical intentionality that is significantly more sophisticated than the opportunistic smelting of whatever local ore was available, which is the level most textbooks attribute to Bronze Age Egypt. The accepted mainstream view is that Old Kingdom metallurgists developed their alloying practices empirically, through centuries of trial and error smelting that gradually converged on reliable formulas. This is a credible developmental pathway. Most metallurgical traditions evolve through exactly this kind of accumulated practical knowledge. The complication is that the Old Kingdom examples show alloy consistency that under empirical development would typically take considerably longer to achieve than the relatively compressed timeline between Egypt's earliest copper use and the alloy quality visible in Old Kingdom artifacts. There is also the question of the surface treatments visible on certain Old Kingdom metal objects, specifically a smoothness and reflectivity on copper vessels that analysis suggests is not simply the result of polishing. Some researchers have identified surface characteristics consistent with burnishing techniques that work the metal's crystal structure at a microscopic level, producing a surface hardness and reflectivity that ordinary abrasive polishing does not achieve. These techniques are known in modern metallurgy. Their presence in Old Kingdom artifacts implies either independent discovery or a knowledge tradition that has not yet been traced through the documentary record. A civilization that routinely produced objects in metal, with characteristics that took modern materials science centuries to formally understand and reproduce, and that left, in its workshops and archives, almost no theoretical documentation of how it did so. The craft knowledge was real. The record of it is nearly gone. 7 discoveries. A mechanical computer with no mechanical lineage. Possible electrochemical cells from a culture without electrical theory. Temple carvings that look to certain eyes like discharge lamps. Surgical procedures executed without the anatomical framework modern surgery treats as prerequisite. Bronze objects manufactured in quantity across an entire empire, mentioned nowhere in that empire's vast written record. A carved monolith in the Andes that may be a functioning hydraulic map of a real landscape, damaged before anyone catalogued it fully. and metalwork whose surface characteristics imply techniques that materials science spent centuries formally rediscovering. The question that opened this investigation was, what happens to our understanding of ancient capability when the evidence consistently outpaces the timeline we've built around it? The honest answer is that the timeline bends. It has bent before. Göbekli Tepe added 12,000 years to the story of organized human construction. The full scale of Amazonian civilization was invisible until recently. Hidden beneath the jungle canopy, revealed only by LiDAR surveys that showed city-scale infrastructure across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of what had been assumed to be untouched forest. The ancient record is not fixed. It is a function of what we have been able to see and of the tools we're using to look. Both of those things keep changing. None of the 7 things we've examined tonight require a dramatic or conspiratorial explanation. They don't need hidden civilizations or lost technology in the science fiction sense. What they need, and what they consistently aren't getting, is sustained, adequately funded, methodologically serious investigation that takes their anomalous features as data rather than noise. The Antikythera Mechanism was found in 1901 and not properly understood for 50 years. Its full complexity wasn't decoded until imaging technology arrived that its discoverers couldn't have imagined. What else is sitting in museum storage, or underwater, or beneath sediment, waiting for a technology we haven't built yet to make it legible? The ancient world was not uniformly primitive. It was not uniformly sophisticated either. It was a complex, varied, geographically dispersed record of human problem-solving across tens of thousands of years, much of which is gone, some of which survived in forms we don't yet know how to read, and a small fraction of which has reached us intact enough to ask questions about. The questions it asks us are not small ones. How did they do it? How much did they understand? What did they know that we have not recovered? These are not rhetorical gestures. They are open research problems, sitting at the edge of what the current archive can answer. The mechanism in its museum case, the dodecahedron in its display cabinet, function unknown after 2,000 years of inquiry. The carvings in the temple crypt that look, in a certain light, like something that should not be there. They are all still waiting, patient, precise, and not fully explained, for us to become capable of understanding them. We may not be there yet,